Let me tell you why Iron Man was such a popular movie. Iron Man was the movie that we needed in 2008. Yes, it was a fun superhero movie, but it also resonates with layered meaning and symbolism that made it strike a chord with Americans who were still reeling from 9/11 and two wars in the Middle East. Beyond all the Easter eggs, Iron Man has a deeper meaning. And in this video, I'm going to explain what's the point of Iron Man. Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan. So much has already been said about this movie. There's Easter eggs, there's behind the scenes, how it launched the MCU. But I'm always more interested in why a movie resonates with us. I think that Tony Stark struck a chord with Americans that hit us in a very personal way, and it made us kind of imprint on Tony Stark. The movie is also filled with subtle symbolism and biblical allegories that I'm going to talk about in a bit. But first, I have to really give you some context on where America was exactly when this movie came out. So let's talk about the America of George W. Bush.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Now watch this drive.
More than any other MCU movie, Iron Man was grounded in the real world. The opening shot of a Humvee in Afghanistan could be from any war movie or even news footage. So this opening shot very clearly connects the world of Iron Man to our world. So what was that world like? Well, in 2008, it had only been 7 years since 9/11. George W. Bush had pushed an aggressive policy to find and kill any terrorists on the planet, which is difficult because terrorists are notorious for not carrying around signs that say, "Kill me, I'm a terrorist." We had invaded 2 countries, Osama bin Laden was still at large, and the insurgency in Iraq was causing massive civilian casualties and draining American blood and treasure. We did not find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and many Americans felt like we'd been lied to. The war on terror was not a slam dunk battle with easy to define enemies. It seemed endless, like we were always going to be waiting for the next terror attack or always invading another country or bombing another place. Every time there was breaking news, you kind of held your breath. We watched hostages get beheaded on YouTube, which was actually emulated in Tony's hostage video. Americans were scared and we needed a hero. Enter Tony Stark. Now, before you even walked into the movie, audiences were already rooting for this character because this was a comeback story for Robert Downey Jr. after his battles with addiction. Tony Stark became a flawed, all-American stand-in that, frankly, every American can relate to.
I want an American cheeseburger.
That's right, Tony Stark is America. First of all, he's a celebrity, and Americans love to live vicariously through celebrities. We imitate how they dress, we imitate their makeup, we follow their personal lives, we even watch TV shows about their houses and cars. Heck, we even elected 2 celebrity presidents. Seeing Tony Stark drink alcohol and womanize allowed the mostly straight male audience to live vicariously through him. In his very first scene, he even talks about women like they're on a scorecard.
Is it true you went 12 for 12 with last year's Maximum Cover models?
Yes and no. March and I had a scheduling conflict, but fortunately the Christmas cover was twins.
And he wins a philosophical debate with a reporter by sleeping with her, which is really the movie's way of saying that everybody wants to be near power and celebrity, even if they find that particular celebrity kind of disgusting. But Tony's not just a celebrity, he actually represents all of America. So when I say that Tony Stark represents all of America, what I really mean is that his early actions mirror American foreign policy post 9/11. Much like the United States, Tony had been escalating wars in the Middle East, and like most Americans, he was largely personally disconnected from this violence. Tony is also the personification of the military-industrial complex.
What's a military what is that?
Well, actually, Dwight D. Eisenhower warned Americans about this during his farewell address.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
So essentially, for the first 140 years-ish of our existence, the United States did not have a large standing army, because we largely kept out of the world's conflicts. During World War II, though, all of American industry was harnessed to make tanks, ships, and the weapons to win the war. And the companies that made those weapons became incredibly wealthy. So following the war, those companies lobbied Congress to continue spending money on more and more weapons, creating a feedback loop where America would always make weapons and always have a large military, because there would always be threats like the Soviet Union, Communist, Grenada, you get the idea. And this was Tony Stark at the beginning of the movie. He is a man who does not care about individual causes or politics. He just wants to make machines and make money so he can make more machines.
Yeah, peace. I love peace. I'll be out of a job with peace.
He is amoral, powerful, and the most dangerous man on the planet. Now, the movie Iron Man takes the point of view that it's great to have a strong military, but that military needs to have a strong moral center. It needs to have a heart. Because that's how Americans see ourselves. We may drop bombs on other countries, but our heart is always in the right place. And in this movie, our heart is represented by Tony Stark, and his literal heart, the arc reactor. Tony is American wish fulfillment in the post-9/11 age. Let me say that again for emphasis. Tony Stark is American wish fulfillment in the post-9/11 age. We begin the movie living vicariously through his celebrity, but eventually we live vicariously through his foreign policy. And just to give you some historical context here, following 9/11, the Bush administration put together a coalition of nations to invade Afghanistan and fight al-Qaeda. 18 months later, when they wanted to invade Iraq, a broad coalition did not emerge. So America, with some help from Britain, Poland, and literally, this is true, 2,000 monkeys from Morocco, actually I think they just offered the monkeys but never sent them, but you get the point. The United States unilaterally invaded Iraq in March of 2003. See, unilateral action is a very American thing to do. It showcases the idea of American exceptionalism, that we alone can fix this problem. It's what a cowboy would do. Just stand up and shoot the bad guy and walk off into the sunset. And this is why Tony Stark created his armor. He doesn't trust anyone else with this level of power. Like Uncle Sam, he can kick just enough ass all by himself. Thank you very much.
I don't want this winding up in the wrong hands. Maybe mine can actually do some good.
Tony's first mission as Iron Man begins when he watches terrorists on the news.
Simple farmers and herders from peaceful villages have been driven from their homes, displaced from their lands by warlords.
And you know, a lot of Americans would watch scenes like this on the news and think, I wish we could just go over there and end this. So, when Tony Stark puts on his armor and soars off into a no-fly zone and kicks the shit out of some terrorists, that was cathartic for a country that was stuck in an endless war on terror.
He's all yours.
I cannot overstate how perfectly Iron Man was able to bridge this political divide in the 2000s. On the one end, there were conservatives who were ready to unilaterally invade anyone and take down any enemy. Like Toby Keith saying, we'll put a boot in your ass, it's the American way. Even when Tony is first attacked, he replies,
My turn.
And that really struck a chord with Americans reeling from our own attack of 9/11, who were looking for a way to punch our way out of trouble. The line even echoed Bush's famous speech at Ground Zero.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
But the movie also appealed to war-weary liberals because it showed a clear way out of this conflict. When the terrorists hide behind human shields, Iron Man can deploy the ultimate smart bomb to only kill the bad guys. When the terrorist leader hides in a building, Iron Man can break through the rock and pull him out. Remember, Bin Laden was still at large at this point. It was an extremely frustrating time for Americans. Smashing through a hiding place to nab a terrorist leader was American wish fulfillment writ large. But then, Iron Man did not stay behind to nation build or police the area. He gives the terrorists to the people so they can deliver their own justice.
He's all yours.
He is not an occupier, he's a liberator. Iron Man delivered the war on terror that the Bush administration promised us.
Because I really do believe we will be greeted as liberators.
Iron Man shows what we actually wanted. A strong person, a hero, to rise up and tell us that everything was going to be okay. Yes, this person was flawed, but so are we. And he likes cheeseburgers, money, and rock and roll. Tony Stark is America.
Basically, I'm here to announce that we're building Iron Man.
But we don't just relate to Tony because he's a genius billionaire unilateral ass kicker. Tony Stark works as a character because we relate to him, his trauma, his struggles with technology, and his role in his generation.
What do you mean, his role in his generation?
Well, no one ever really talks about this, but Tony Stark is like the definitive Gen Xer.
Like the X-Men?
No, although there is a really good X-Men comic called Generation X. So like all through the 20th century, scholars have loved labeling generations of Americans. It's very silly and unscientific, but it's an easy way to take a few million people and lump them into an easy to understand category. Tom Brokaw famously called people who survived the Great Depression and fought in World War II the greatest generation. And then the massive population boom afterwards gave us the baby boomers. But then in the 1980s and 90s, the media struggled to label the children of the boomers. This new generation didn't seem to have a defining characteristic, so photographer Robert Kappa nicknamed them Generation X. Now look, like I said, painting a large swath of people with the same brush is silly, but I do think there are certain stereotypical characteristics of Generation X that do apply. They were the MTV generation, they popularized video games, and they had a sense of alienation that stemmed from growing divorce rates in the United States.
We are getting a divorce.
More and more kids were considered latchkey kids, meaning that they arrived home from school and found an empty house. So we have a generation that loves music, technology, and feels isolated by apps and parenting. That is Tony Stark. But more importantly, Generation X lacked a place in the historical story of America. The great Gen X filmmaker David Fincher made what I consider to be the definitive Gen X movie, Fight Club. In that movie, Tyler Durden gives a monologue that I think perfectly sums up Generation X and also Tony Stark.
We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war.
So Gen X grew up hearing their grandparents talk about the war, the depression. They heard their parents talk about the social revolution of the 60s. But they did not have a national challenge to meet. Like Tony Stark, they only had the stories of their forebears to live up to. That is, until 9/11, when Gen X's Great War became the War on Terror, a nebulous conflict that lacked clear boundaries or goals, which in hindsight, kind of the perfect war for Generation X. This, again, is like Tony Stark. His life was largely aimless, enjoying the creature comforts of wealth until a terrorist attack made him grow a social conscience. But Iron Man does not just work as a call to arms for Generation X. It is a movie about a generational battle with boomer Obadiah Stane and the specter of the greatest generation, Howard Stark. See, Obadiah was a baby boomer, the first generation to be truly shaped by the military-industrial complex. Now, there's this cultural myth that every baby boomer was a hippie and went to peace rallies or fought in the Vietnam War, and that's just not true.
Amen. Make love, not war.
But every boomer did watch those events on TV, and those events shaped their perception of the world.
Tony, come on, we built that thing to shut the hippies up.
Obadiah is the end result of the military-industrial complex. He provides arms to both sides of the war, indifferent to why people are fighting. He just needs endless war to make endless money. He's always surrounded with wealth and technology. He's always either drinking or smoking, like a 19th century Thomas Nast cartoon of a robber baron. But Stane is most defined by his relationship with technology. So the boomers have a reputation for a strong social consciousness that was shaped by the civil rights movement and their experience with Vietnam. But Stane is actually the inverse of that. He has no morality. Tony's armor is powered by his heart. Well, actually, a lot more on that later. But Stane's Ironmonger armor has no heart. In fact, his most terrifying scene is when he steals a heart from the hero, actually mimicking the Egyptian god Ammit, who would eat the hearts of the dead to judge them before they enter the afterlife. Appropriate, actually, since after Stane steals Tony's heart, he is essentially resurrected and gets a second chance at life. But again, more on that later. First, let's talk about the greatest generation, Howard Stark. The shadow of Howard Stark looms over Tony for this entire movie. Before Howard was retconned to be co-founder of S.H.I.E.L.D., he was simply a brilliant industrialist who killed Nazis and helped win World War II. This was the man that the world expected Tony Stark to be. The montage of clips tells us that Howard died before his time, leaving Tony alone.
I never got to say goodbye to my father. I would ask him how he felt about what this company did, if he was conflicted, if he ever had doubts. Or maybe he was every inch the man we all remember from the newsreels.
And often when we experience a traumatic event, especially when we're still adolescent, our growth is stunted to that time period. We're basically stuck at that age mentally. So Tony's parents died when he was an adolescent, so he continues to act as an adolescent. He never really knew his father, so he's always trying to live up to what he thought his dad would want him to be.
There's questions that I would ask him. I would ask him how he felt about what this company did.
Tony even invokes his dad's memory to evoke a sense of American tradition, of being a badass.
That's how Dad did it. That's how America does it.
In fact, when he defends himself to Christine, his first impulse is to invoke his father's legacy.
My father helped defeat the Nazis. He worked on the Manhattan Project. A lot of people would call that being a hero.
Now, buried in there is Tony's real reason for becoming Iron Man, to be a hero like his father. But the movie and Tony struggle to define Howard's legacy. Obadiah remembers Howard as a winner-take-all capitalist like himself.
You made your father proud.
But the movie gives us hints that this is not true. The media and the military-industrial complex have mischaracterized Howard's legacy to make him seem like a cold-hearted weapons manufacturer. But in reality, he wanted to create clean energy. He built the arc reactor that Tony miniaturized and perfected. So the arc reactor represents Howard's true legacy, a legacy that is always being carried around by his son. And Howard's legacy isn't that technology is inherently good or bad, it's how we apply and use that technology. The arc arc reactor can be used as a weapon. It defeats Obadiah's stain, and it powers the Iron Man suit, but it also provides clean energy, just as Tony's suit can cause death and destruction while the arc reactor is keeping him alive. Now, this is similar to how Howard's generation, the greatest generation, gave us the atomic bomb, but then the question is, how do we use this new atomic energy? Do we use it to make bombs to destroy the world? Do we use it to create clean energy, to stoke fear, to make money? This moral question is symbolized by Tony's arc reactor, which resides at the literal heart of the main character. So now let's talk about the heart of Tony Stark. Ironically, Tony Stark was just like the terrorist that he tries to defeat.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Well, you see, Tony's money wasn't made through war. It was made through fear.
Is it better to be feared or respected? Is it too much to ask for both?
And terrorists traffic in fear. Terror is literally part of their name. While Tony is making money by using Americans' fears of threats, both foreign and domestic. That way, Americans will continue to buy his weaponry. But Tony wouldn't say that he sells war. He thinks that he sells peace.
To peace. Peace means having a bigger stick than the other guy.
And of course, this is similar to American foreign policy. The Department of Defense used to be called the Department of War. Ever since World War II, America has become the world's police force, with American troops embedded on every single continent on Earth, and basically always at the ready to attack anyone who threatens the interest of America or our allies. And there are very real, very scary threats across the planet, and it's a good thing that American troops are there to keep certain nations in check. However, if it weren't for fear of these other nations, fear of other threats, then Americans wouldn't have such a large military. But it's also fitting that Tony's heart is part machine, because for his entire life, Tony has placed all of his faith in machines and not in people. He has robots instead of friends. It's a lonely life that has turned Tony into a kind of machine, a tool that is being used by Stain and the military-industrial complex. Obadiah even calls him a golden goose who prints money for the company. Now, this idea of Tony as a machine who is used to create war is made literal when he's kidnapped by the Ten Rings, and then he's literally strapped to a battery like a machine. And then the terrorists simply use him as a tool to create weapons for themselves to stoke fear. In a warped, twisted way, Tony is doing the same thing for the terrorists that he's done for the American government for years. And his arc in this movie is to realize that he can't trust anybody with these weapons. Not the US government, and especially not the terrorists or Stark Industries. Like earlier in the movie, we even see how cold and mechanical Tony Stark is when he sleeps with Christine and then has a robot greet her and he throws her out like trash. Tony is the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, a hollow man made of metal who thinks that he doesn't have a heart, but he ends up having a bigger heart than he could have ever dreamed.
Now I know I've got a heart, because it's breaking.
Now, of course, the movie's inciting incident is when Tony Stark's own weapon causes a wound to his heart, a symbolic wound showing that his old life as a weapons manufacturer was actually poisoning the good man who is inside of him. His heart is then replaced with technology that is powerful yet artificial. The arc reactor represents Tony's potential to use his abilities to commit great evil or great good in the world.
That is your legacy, Stark. Your life's work in the hands of those murderers.
The metaphor of Tony's heart is also used to show his romantic bond with Pepper. Now, Pepper watches a news report about Tony on TV before he invites her into the basement to reach into his chest, literally letting her into his heart. He tells her to throw away the old arc reactor because it has no material value for him. This is a sort of machine-like thinking. This unit is defective, throw it away. But Pepper uses this reactor to show Tony that she can see who he really is, that, like the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, he has had a heart all along. This duality of the arc reactor as a weapon for good or evil also kicks into gear in our third act. Obadiah Stane steals the arc reactor from Tony's chest, just like how the military-industrial complex was stealing his soul, while Pepper's faith and sentimentality is what restores his life. In fact, later in the movie, as Tony's arc reactor is dimming out and going dead, Pepper's voice actually makes Tony's heart beat once again and come to life. Now, it's fitting that Tony ends up with this symbiotic relationship with technology because technology has defined his entire life. When Tony is captured, he doesn't even bother to learn Jensen's name until he sees that he's also very good with machines. See, for years, when Tony Stark was a weapons manufacturer, he always believed that the ideas were king, and he never had a thought for how his weapons were used, any more than a goose laying golden eggs cares what you do with the gold. But the problem with weaponry is that it's a Pandora's box. Once it's out in the world, it's always out in the world.
You really think that just because you have an idea, it belongs to you?
But the Iron Man technology is different because, unlike bombs or missiles, it can only be powered by Tony Stark's heart. The Iron Man suit is the ultimate expression of Tony finally taking accountability for his talent and his actions. Like, for instance, Obadiah's suit was just a copy. It's all surface with a few upgrades. Bigger and louder, but not more sophisticated.
How'd you solve the icing problem?
Icing problem.
Might want to look into it.
Just like how the US military can create all the weaponry at once, but it requires strong moral character and leadership to know exactly when and how to use that weaponry. It's the reason we don't throw atomic bombs on anybody that annoys us. The movie Iron Man was created at a time of great fear and paranoia for Americans when we were redefining our place in the world. This is part of the reason we all related to Tony Stark. Now back to the whole thing with Tony Stark trafficking in fear. You see, Tony Stark has lived his entire life in fear. Fear of failure, fear of his dad's disapproval, fear of attachment, and he profited over the fears of others, like we talked about. And when he became Iron Man, though, he tried to make people unafraid by taking all of their fears and anxieties upon himself. And that way, he becomes a kind of Christ figure, taking on the sins of the world.
Hold on. Where's this religious Bible stuff coming from?
Well, from Jon Favreau. I mean, Favreau is half Catholic and half Jewish. He filled The Mandalorian Season 3 with references to Judaism that we covered in this deeper meaning video. Intentional or not, he imbues Tony Stark with many biblical characteristics, like this line.
Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar.
Jesus said that when he was talking about separation of religion and state. Jesus also exited a cave following his resurrection, and Tony exits the cave in his Iron Man Mark I, resurrected as a new man. After his resurrection, Jesus ascended to heaven, and Tony actually ascended to heaven as well, flying away. Tony wandered the desert like a biblical prophet, and the scales then fall from his eyes.
Now just say right now?
Well, in most of Tony's pre-cave scenes, he is wearing thick sunglasses. Sunglasses are a way of disguising yourself and hiding your face from the world. After he becomes Iron Man, he rarely wears sunglasses, at least in this movie. He is like the Apostle Paul, who was a sinful bounty hunter named Saul who was tracking down Christians until God temporarily struck him blind. After a time, the scales fell from his eyes and Saul was reborn as the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, maybe, but that's kind of a stretch.
Well, consider this. Tony also names his missile the Jericho.
The Jericho.
Jericho was a city in the Old Testament that was a gateway to Judea. After the Israelites had wandered the desert for 40 years following their liberation from slavery, a warrior named Joshua led the Israelites in shouting really loud to make the walls of Jericho fall, and then the Israelites could enter the Promised Land. And in the movie, the Jericho missile has the ability to break down walls and also to attack Americans. But it's also the first weapon to be powered by the same repulsor technology that Tony uses in his Iron Man suit. In other words, it's a sonic technology that has the power of a god, like a bunch of Israelites shouting at a wall until it falls down. And just to wrap up the biblical symbolism, in the final act, Stain is framed like a demonic figure. It calls to mind a dungeon, sort of like hell, where sinful people are trapped for eternity, or even like a spider web. Later, he comes out of the ground like a demon coming out of hell, while Tony descends from the sky like an angel. Now, do I think Favreau did all this intentionally? Probably not. The Jericho thing, definitely for sure. But the story of Jesus is similar to many myths from different cultures around the world. And that is part of the reason why the story of Iron Man resonates with us so much. But I think the story really resonated with us because of the Godzilla factor.
Yeah, I've never heard of that.
I just made it up. The Godzilla factor is named after how the Japanese people were able to use the film Godzilla to cope with their trauma from the atomic bomb. Now, I am not the first person to point out this metaphor, not by a long shot. William Suitzi, author of Godzilla on My Mind, 50 Years of the King of Monsters, talked about how Japanese censorship forbade filmmakers from talking about the bomb in their films. So for moviegoers, seeing a monster that was radiation-made flesh destroying a city allowed them to have discourse over the tragedy, and the movie actually ends on a point of optimism. But in Iron Man, this Godzilla factor connected Tony Stark to the horrific terrorist attacks on 9/11. Now, we had lots of movies come out about 9/11 in that decade, and also about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The best of these films recreated those events with shocking accuracy and a journalistic touch. Films like Paul Greengrass's Flight 93 were very honest filmmaking, but they didn't offer audiences a narrative escape from our trauma. But in Iron Man, and in the entire MCU, Marvel delivered the perfect escapist fantasy to help us cope with this tragedy. Much like all Americans, Tony Stark suffered a horrific tragedy that shattered his illusion of comfort and safety. For America, it was 9/11, and for Tony Stark, it was his capture at the hands of terrorists. Afterwards, Tony reflects on his childhood.
I never got to say goodbye to Dad. I never got to say goodbye to my father.
Just like how any tragedy makes people sit back and reflect on their lives. And then he retreats into his man cave after escaping from a different cave. And, you know, maybe a lot of us did that too in the months or years after 9/11. It was very easy to retreat into our homes as the world got scarier and bigger. See, Tony goes through all these various coping mechanisms to cope with his PTSD, just like many American veterans and first responders. But after his rescue, much like Americans, he was filled with renewed purpose.
Shouldn't be alive. Unless it was for a reason.
He casts aside his old life and he is reborn.
There's no art opening. There is no benefit. There is nothing. There is the next mission.
Now, this isn't really how every American coped with 9/11, but it's how we wished we coped with 9/11. We saw Tony Stark and we saw who we wanted to be. Tony Stark is filled with vast potential. He's complex, he's contradictory, he makes mistakes, but he always gets back up. Hell, there is nothing more American than that.
Wow, that was really sweet and patriotic, and I just don't know what to say about that.
And the bravest thing about the movie Iron Man is that the hero doesn't actually change.
Wait, what do you mean? He was a bad guy, and then he becomes a superhero.
Yeah, but as Reba explained in another one of our videos, he goes from making killing machines for money to making a single killing machine for his own pleasure. Everything Tony does throughout the MCU is done to alleviate his own guilt, to make him feel better about his past sins. But this movie starts him on a moral journey that takes him to Avengers Endgame when he finally uses his powers for self-sacrifice. You see, in all the other movies, Tony is just motivated by guilt.
I shouldn't be alive. Unless it was for a reason.
But in Endgame, Tony had a great life. He's at peace, and he risks that peaceful life to help others. Iron Man is a portrait of a flawed man who is trying to find his real purpose in the world. And guys, I mean, that's us. We're all scared. We are all flawed. And all we can really ask of ourselves is that we keep trying. That's Tony Stark. Tony Stark is us. We are Iron Man. Well guys, that's just my thoughts on Iron Man. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Harriet.